Good morning. I'm Ronan O'Malley with the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, standing in for George Willey. Welcome to The Other Side. In this program, we will interview interesting people who have had an influence on the world, a country, or their communities. We explore their life, beliefs, views, and then ask them to consider positions that may be contrary to theirs. This gives rise to an authentic discussion that goes beyond the headlines and enables us to hear perspectives contrary to our own. Most recently, following a recent event at the World Affairs Council, we had the pleasure of sitting down with Somini Sengupta, a George Polk Award-winning journalist covering the United Nations for the New York Times. Sengupta takes us with her on her journey through her acclaimed book, The End of Karma: Hope and Fury Among India's Young, as we delve further into her life and the India of today. Just before we get started into the book itself, I'd just kind of like to know a bit more about yourself. You're someone who's grown up between India and the United States and also spent some time in Canada. And I know some of this is what gave you your impetus for writing the book. Could you maybe give us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, and thank you for having me on the program. I was born in India, and I came here when I was a little girl. I was just turning 8. And my family first moved to Canada because we had relatives in Canada. So as with many immigrant families, we followed my uncle as it happened. And I grew up mostly in Southern California. I went to junior high school and high school in Southern California. I went to college in California at the University of California at Berkeley. And then I became a journalist and went back to India about 30 years after I left. So we left in 1975, and I went back in 2005.
And between 75 and 2005, had you gone back with your family at all?
Yeah, I mean, every few summers, you know, we would save up all our money and all our vacation time, and every couple of summers we would go back to visit relatives. But of course, you know, we would only go back to Calcutta. I would only see generally a very protected small corner of India, and it was only when I went back in 2005 as a grown-up and as a journalist did I really kind of, you know, get to know the country. Yeah.
And when you got to India and you were there, I believe, you know, posted as the bureau chief for the New York Times, how did you find the country? Once you kind of had a chance to go out into the country, into the city itself, outside of the city, into different provinces, different states, how did you find it? Were you surprised? Were you kind of thought this is roughly where it was, or was it kind of eye-opening?
No, I mean, I was constantly blown away and intrigued and bewildered, which is a great way to be for a journalist, you know, and there was never any shortage of stories for me to chase. And it was pretty clear to me early on that this was a really, really young country. And when you look at the numbers, that is abundantly clear. India has 420 million people just between the ages of 15 and 34. 420 million. That exceeds the population, the combined population of the United States, Canada, and Britain. And so at a time when the rest of the world is aging, India is really where the young are. And one of the most mind-blowing figures that I stumbled upon in writing this book is that every month, between now and 2030, every month, 1 million Indians turn 18. So,
and this is not entirely, but largely what was kind of the inspiration and the kind of focal point and kind of backbone for your book. In your book, I think you've kind of, I think you said it was kind of in reverence and kind of a reference to Salman Rushdie's midnight, the concept of midnight. You chose the idea of noonday's children, noonday's generation. Can you explain that and why you chose the topic? Sorry, the term?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, this book is really about 3 generations of my own family. My father was part of Midnight's children, so he was born just before independence. And midnight, of course, refers to midnight, August 15th, 1947. That's when India became independent from British rule. So that's his generation. He is Midnight's children. I'm sort of in between. I'm the generation that comes right after. And my daughter's generation is Noonday's children, what I call Noonday's children. And I call them Noonday's children because they are really this impatient, hungry, red-hot generation. And in a way, they are shining the light on some of India's most important fault lines. And I think this is a really transformative generation. Transformative for India, but inevitably also transformative for the rest of us.
And for this concept of noonday's children, this generation, I know you chose the 1991 economic reforms, so it would be some of the children came to age around that time and since then. Could you discuss what some of those reforms were, and the fact that they weren't kind of something that were planned out and predicted for years and years? It wasn't some grand economic policy, but it was more something born out of necessity. So what those reforms were and what they resulted in.
So 1991 was a real turning point, because until that point, India had had a fairly state-driven, planned economy. And 1991 was a moment when, the Soviet Union was collapsing. There was the first Gulf War. There was a real balance of payments crisis in India, and the country was compelled to just start opening up the economy. And it did so without fanfare. It did so very quietly, very gradually, and slowly it began to open up to the global economy. It started lifting some of the, the license regime, the government license regime. It allowed more and more foreign investment in more and more sectors, and slowly but surely it really uncorked tremendous entrepreneurial energy, and for the next 20 years, India enjoyed fairly steady economic growth. And during the period that I was there, there were some really just great years of macroeconomic growth in the 8 and 9%. It was widely celebrated, but of course, it did not address some of the most fundamental problems that India has faced, principally poverty and inequality, which remains very stark and very serious.
And then to move on to the title of the book, The End of Karma, I know, like we've discussed before, it's a concept, the idea of no longer being defined by your past, by your family, by your caste. The idea that you could chart your own destiny. It's something, like you told me, was initially hoped for with the independence in 1947 and the new constitution, the ideas of equality amongst all people in India. Perhaps that didn't happen then. It's something that people have been yearning from since then. How is this generation different, and how is it that they, perhaps more than any other, will perhaps achieve the sense of an end of karma?
So, India, like the United States, has a record of deep, profound inequalities. In the case of the United States, the institution of slavery. In the case of India, the caste system. And yet, India's constitution, like our own constitution, makes this audacious promise. It says everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. And in some ways, India's history over the last 70 years has been to hold true to that promise. And what I'm referring to by the title, The End of Karma, is simply this notion that really struck me when I talked to young people, that they didn't want to be bound by their past. They were born with one destiny. They wanted to make another destiny, which is a very familiar story, to me as an American. And I was quite captivated by that sense of aspiration among India's young.
Okay, and then to kind of bring your book to a larger audience, kind of to the United States and to the world itself, what is in particular that you feel we as in the US and the rest of the world should get out of this book? Why is it that people should be concerned about what's happening in India? How would you address that question?
Yeah, I mean, so you asked me earlier, why did I write this book? And really, honestly, there are two reasons. I wrote it to better understand the country that made me and the country that made my daughter. We are both daughters of India. But more broadly, I wanted to write this book so that Americans and others would get to know this country a little bit better through the eyes of its young. And why do I think that's important? Because first of all, India is going to be the most populous country in the world in another 6 years. By 2022, its population is expected to overtake China's, and it will be the most populous nation, but it's already the youngest nation on Earth. So I think inevitably when you have such a large and young country, it's going to affect so many things for the rest of us, from migration, global migration, to demands on the global economy, to how the world deals with climate change, to political stability in a very important part of the world. So on all these issues, I think India is going to be a really key place to watch. And I think it's important for all of us to get to know it a little better.
Could you also talk about, it's a major component in most of the chapters of your book, the state of and the impact of education in India. It's, I think, something that's quite eye-opening for me when I read it. You know, we always think of India being a well-educated, you know, very literate population, large number of people, you know, tens of millions of people are very fluent in English. Can you talk about perhaps between the perceptions people have of education and the realities on the ground?
So can I tell you a story? I once, a few years ago, went to a village school, an ordinary village in North India, and I remember being there on a winter morning, and it was a cold winter morning, and there were just streams of children running across the field to the one schoolhouse in the village. And they were wearing these, you know, mismatched shirts and pants, and girls were wearing dresses that were held together by safety pins. These were very, very poor children. These were all children who were coming to school for the first time in their families. In other words, these were first-generation learners. And that is a remarkable shift that's happened in India. In my father's generation, 50% of children were going to school. Today, primary school enrollment is almost universal. Boys and girls are enrolled in primary school. And that's just a remarkable shift in the last 50, 60 years. So these kids were coming to the school. The school was just a two-room schoolhouse. There weren't enough chairs, there weren't enough benches for them to sit on, so they brought these rice sacks, these empty rice sacks. They flattened them out and they sat on the ground, or they sat on the porch of the school. Half the teachers were there, half hadn't shown up. The man who was the headmaster of the school, the principal of the school, was very busy taking attendance, and he was very frustrated because he said, I have no idea how to teach so many kids. I've never had so many kids coming to school before. They were all reading kind of mismatched textbooks. They were trying to follow along in their books, but really they weren't learning very much. And I went there with a social worker who works with a group, a very interesting group, that measures every year what are school children learning when they come to school. And what they're finding year after year is actually quite dispiriting. They're finding that among fifth graders, those who have been in school nominally for 5 years, half of them can't read a second grade textbook, which means that they're functionally illiterate. Half of them can't subtract. And I'll never forget what this young man told me at the end of that morning. He said, you know, when these children, when they grow up, they're going to curse us because they're going to say, we came to school and we learned nothing. And this, I think, is really one of the most worrisome things about India today. You have an incredible demographic moment. You've got all these children, all of whom are rushing to school. Their parents are investing in their education in some way, in some nominal way, and yet they're not getting anything like a decent education. They're not being prepared at all for the modern economy.
We'll be right back with more of our conversation with Somini Sengupta.
On The Other Side, we interview a variety of people and seek to examine their beliefs, their opinions, and their passions. Then we invite them to come with us to the other side and look at the antithesis of their views. What comes out is an in-depth conversation without the vitriol of the talk shows, but a cerebral engaging of ideas you will not find anywhere else. Come join us on alternate Saturdays on this channel. If you'd like to recommend a guest for The Other Side, contact us at the email address on the screen.
And then just to move on to a topic that, again, you know, permeates your book from the introduction all the way through the epilogue, the issue of the caste system. And that obviously significant steps been made. You know, a lot has been enshrined in the Constitution, other legal issues. What ways has the impact of the caste system been reduced? What are the real impacts, the real changes, and what are those that still need to happen? At what level? Is that at different levels? Is that more at a personal level, more at a societal level? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to talk about India without talking about the caste system. It is an important institution. It remains one. What has changed is the original currency of the caste system has definitely diminished, right? Caste determined what you and I would do for a living and what our children would do for a living. That has diminished. It hasn't gone away, but it doesn't, your caste does not entirely determine what kind of a job you're going to have. However, it's very important in marriage. It's very important in politics. So it often shapes who you're going to vote for, because you might get your man or your woman in an important political office, and that might accrue benefits for your community. So, you know, it's a practical
And could you give
move.
some example of what those benefits would be? Say,
Well, it could be, you know, a contract, a government contract, you know, to build a school building or something that goes to a member of your community. It could be a road that comes into your part of the village. I mean, it could be real concrete things. Caste is also very, very important in marriage. It remains so. Cross-caste marriages, inter-caste marriages do happen, but they are not the norm. And sometimes marrying across caste lines is punished quite severely. And I write about one young couple in Delhi, in the heart of Delhi, not in some far-removed village somewhere in the back of beyond. In Delhi, a young couple who belonged to two rival castes. They chose one another. They were fairly traditional in every other way, but they fell in love. They chose one another, they ran away, and they got married. And their parents initially, you know, were uncomfortable, but slowly they made some peace with it. And then something happened in their neighborhood. There was another cross-caste love affair that happened. Another girl ran away with the man that she loved. And what happened was this so infuriated the young men in that community that they turned on this couple and they murdered her. And the young man who was charged in the murder of the young woman I write about and her husband was her little brother. So it wasn't, you know, not only did it not take place in some back of beyond village, it wasn't a case of some, you know, elderly gentleman who just couldn't bear the way these young people were conducting themselves. It was a member of her generation. You know, it was another young person. And so this really haunted me. And so I went to chase down this story. And of course, I reconstructed the story by interviewing members of their families, members of their community. And one of the things that I found sort of hopeful in this otherwise very depressing story is that the brother of the husband, the young man who was killed, his older brother was very traditional, you know, would never dream of marrying across caste lines, had an arranged marriage, but after his brother was killed, he also became a father. He became father to a little girl, and his brother's death, his brother's murder, really shifted something in him. And I asked him, you know, do you think that these things will change by the time your daughter grows up? And he was absolutely adamant that it would. You know, he said, I am not going to stand in the way. If she wants to choose her own partner, if she wants to make her own way in the world, I'm not going to stand in the way. He was in many ways a changed man. And so in this story, as in many of the stories in my book, there is so much fury. You know, there's so much nihilism and anger and frustration, but there's also a great deal of hope. And to me, the transformation of the older brother and his becoming a different kind of father was a real emblem of hope for me.
And then you're mentioning, you know, two of the individuals in your book, in one of the, you know, great chapters. Maybe just to cover a few others, and I definitely would encourage people to get the book and read about all of them. Maybe you could talk about Unna Bomb, the son of basically an impoverished rickshaw driver, someone from a lower caste, but someone who had obviously an incredible drive and determination, and perhaps most importantly, an incredible mother who was absolutely 1,000% behind him, always driving him, always helping him, always pushing him in education, and basically his real rags to riches story, and how that's maybe emblematic for what can happen for others in India.
Yeah, I mean, Unna Bomb, I met when he was 17, and as you point out, he came from a very modest family. His father drove one of those three-wheeled auto rickshaws in a tough town in North India called Patna, and Unna Bomb grew up in a pretty tough neighborhood. He did not have electricity around the clock. He did not have schools that worked. He did have an extraordinary mother who completely believed that this was her golden child. And so when Unna Bomb came home one day and said, you know, Mother, I'm going to drop out of school in the 4th grade and I'm going to study by myself, she never doubted him. She never said, no, you have to go back to school, or you have to go to work, or you have to help me with the housework. She never said any of that. She went and found a tutor who could help him when he said, Mother, I would like to go to the Indian Institutes of Technology, which is one of the hardest colleges to get into in the entire world. She never disbelieved him. She'd never heard of the Indian Institutes of Technology. She had no idea what they were, but she never disbelieved him. She said, okay, yeah, this is possible if this is what you want to do. And so she pounded the pavement looking for a tutor who could help him. She made sure that the other children were quiet in the house so he could study. She would sit behind him, I've seen her do this, and fan him with a handheld bamboo fan so that the flies and the mosquitoes didn't buzz around his head so he could study in peace. And in the end, Unna Bomb did make it. He did make it to the Indian Institutes of Technology, and he did make it to the other side. But he is not a Horatio Alger story, because his country is not a country of Horatio Algers. He is not typical. He is extraordinary, not just because he is intellectually gifted, but also because he's got this extraordinary fire in the belly, this extraordinary determination. What does make Unna Bomb typical is just one thing. He is full of ambition, and that is the story of his generation. I mean, that his generation is full of extraordinary ambition, and ambition thwarted. Thwarted by schools that don't work, thwarted by a health system that makes 30% of Indian children clinically malnourished, a health system where not every Indian child is immunized against childhood diseases, thwarted by social norms. And so Unna Bomb is an important story to read because he is an exception that in many ways proves the rule, right? And I think in his story is the story of a tremendously determined young man, but also a mother who believes in him.
What do you see as the major issues that Modi and India in general need to address to hopefully kind of get, continue on the right path? And what are the areas that you're most optimistic about relating to India?
So Mr. Modi was elected with a very, very wide margin and came to office almost exactly 2 years ago, and there were some very, very high expectations. He rightly observed that India was a country of young, that India was about to could potentially realize this demographic dividend, as it's called, which is why it's all the more surprising that his government has neither invested in education, in primary education, nor public health, two crucial areas that young Indians need much greater public investment in order to realize their full potential. We talked about the state of the public education system. So it's very surprising to me that his government has not properly invested in those areas. He faces an urgent challenge in making young Indians ready for the workforce and creating those economic opportunities, right? So by some estimates, India needs to create anywhere between 10 and 17 million jobs every year for the next several years. Now that's an unenviable challenge for any government now in this day and age when even manufacturing has become so automated, in the era of 3D printers. So this is a major challenge for him. how to prepare young Indians, how to create those economic opportunities, and I think the other major challenge, the political challenge that he faces is, you know, how to ensure that India will have space for political dissent, for political opinions of all kinds, and how to ensure that India's long tradition of religious freedom will be preserved. There have been some very disturbing incidents where members of India's largest minority, where Muslims, have been killed by lynch mobs on suspicion of slaughtering cattle, which is illegal in some Indian states, but not all. There has been very little accountability for those extrajudicial killings. There's been very little accountability for members of his own party who have said some fairly incendiary things. So I think that political challenge is a very real one. And as you know, every year there are crucial elections across the country. Mr. Modi has already faced two very important ones. The Delhi election a year ago, he lost. The Bihar election, that's a very big state, he lost. The next big test for his party will be the crucial election going on right now in West Bengal, and then next year in Uttar Pradesh. And so those, I think, will be some markers, you know, some indicators as to how his party will fare in the next parliamentary election.
And then lastly, so what would be some of the aspects of India that you're most optimistic, most hopeful about going into the next 5, 10, 20 years?
You know, look, anytime you have a country where 2/3 of the population is under 35, anytime you have a country where the median age is between 26 and 27, that is a dynamic society. That is a society that will change itself from inside, and so, you know, that's why I think it's really important for all of us to pay close attention to the way India is going. It is a transformative time. Just as, you know, our baby boom generation was a transformative time for our own country in the late 60s and the early 70s. You know, the baby boomers changed America. And I think that this generation, what I call High Noon's children, is going to change India. It is changing India from inside. And because it's going to soon be the most populous country on earth, it's going to change the world for the rest of us.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Somini Sengupta, for joining us today, and I'd recommend everyone watching at home to get a copy of her book, The End of Karma. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. And I want to thank you all for joining us today on The Other Side. Thank you.
Thank you very much.